Because in the suggestion that humanism should be criticized, it is not so easy for the audience to imagine what is to be addressed at all. And this is because humanism is simply universal. Humanism is such a universal worldview that there is no one left who holds a deeper worldview. You consider it a worldview if you say someone is more psychoanalytically oriented. Or when someone is a New Age type, and says he believes in the stars or something like that. Or, of course, when someone adheres to the materialistic worldview and considers the laws of historical progress as their guide, then you know what it is. That is considered a worldview, but humanism is so universal. Every person in our society can apply the category that is inhuman. Everyone knows that one is for humanity because it belongs in the center. Everyone is so certain about it that they don't even see it as a particular worldview. Moreover, when it appears as a particular worldview, it already has something bizarre and even slightly comical about it. In the form of the League for Spiritual Freedom, there's humanism as a separate organization, and among other things, for example, also in the lodges which still exist of the Freemasons. But specifically, that now has something truly ridiculous and bizarre. And when they worship humans instead of God, then the normal active humanist knows that this is somehow not what he meant. What is universal, however, essentially only excludes fascists and racists and advocates for the human being one should support, especially when criticizing. Incidentally, there is also conversely suspicion against communists that when they criticize, they are for the human being, and in a certain way, they are also a fine clique. Also, humanists are those who, or general humanism is not at all terribly. At the starting point, it is certainly not hostile towards social critical endeavors. Naturally, the breadth of the standpoint is already somewhat treacherous. Rights and lefts advocate for the human being and accuse the opposing party of not doing so. Christians and psychologists, artists and philosophers all appear in the name of humanity. And what is important to them, they present in this name. Now one must say, the breadth of the standpoint, well, it can indeed appear suspicious, because it doesn't seem particularly suitable for making distinctions. The standpoint, that is for the people. On the other hand, that's not yet the criticism. In the following, we will first consider what it means to stand for humanity, what this standpoint is, and what standing for humanity, being humane, being humanely inclined, really means, what kind of internal dialectic it has, how this standpoint develops. At the outset, and the educated citizen knows this very well, humanism is actually an anti-religious attitude. One knows the age of humanism in the narrow sense. These were the philosophers and theorists historically before the Enlightenment. The famous Erasmus of Rotterdam is a very famous humanist. There were some who said that one must read Latin and Greek. And you can see that people have managed without the Christian God and have also developed a beautiful humanity. Humanism has its main slogan in the phrase, man is the measure of all things. And in this, and now he quickly notices, a company. It is not so easy anymore to say what is actually wrong with it, because the concern sounds like materialism. Humanism is generally, if you want to put it that way, in philosophy, the substitute for materialism. Its internal philosophical version emphasizes that yes, circumstances should adapt to humans and not the other way around. The human, embedded in the formulation, the measure of all things, should not be a means for foreign higher purposes. This is negatively directed against emperors and gods, but also against the idea that the human is an instrument of a historical process, something higher. And in the humanistic circle, the market is extremely popular with its saying that all conditions in which humans are enslaved and contemptible must be abolished. The idealism in the slogan lies in the fact that, on the one hand, it's about propaganda from a standpoint and not about practice. And secondly, in that a measure is set, that man is the measure of all things, which as a measure has no content. Firstly, once again, man is the measure of all things, and he propagates the standpoint. One propagates, one really hears it. One always propagates that nobody should claim something higher. We do not accept anything higher. But what is being propagated, what is not considered higher, does not even appear. Or in other words, the non-higher is the human. But who is that? And what does he want? And what is he entitled to? Measuring everything by humans is a strange measuring, because it is one where there is no content on the other side. I measure everything by humans, and we no longer allow anything against humans. But what is against humans? Let's make a comparison the other way around. When I consider possible interests and institutions, and when I do not propagate from a standpoint, when I ponder, watch what is being played somewhere, what it's about there, what the valid standard is there, then as a result of the consideration, it already becomes clear whether the person who is part of the institution who is involved in this project is well served or not. But then I know what the valid standard is there. It is something completely different. And because I know it, I can easily compare it with this person's interest, or actually I don't even need to do that. He does it himself right away. I can safely rely on that. The person himself compares. Once he knows the nature of the institution he is in, compares it with his interest, and will reject or approve it. Completely different if I start not from an actual situation, an actual interest, but aim to find out what it's about there, and then leave the judgment to the interest of the person involved. It's completely different if I proceed in reverse and say man should be the measure of things. Because I don't even say what the measure of things is. I don't care at all in that sentence. I don't bother with it. What is the measure of things? With us, for example, what is it about? But instead, I stand beside it and establish an art. I try out a standpoint which, secondly, has no real content. Because what the person demands, what benefits them? Yes, that is, and that is the beauty, and that is the productive part. And that is the reason why it is both a philosophical standpoint and quite expressly an idealism. What benefits him is henceforth the subject of speculation for those involved. What arises, like the philosophical framing of materialism, man is supposed to be the measure of things, is then very quickly, when one asks, and what is the content of this measure? A truly idealistic speculative project. Yes, what all man needs, what all suits him. This speculation is terribly important and, in fact, the crucial line of thought. For with what comes out of that, the critique should then be made. With what one can claim as that corresponds to the human being, with what is supposed to be fixed, yes, with that the world must then be measured, and what's important, and what one has a right to. One thing you notice about it, as contentless as it still has a purpose. And the purpose, if you will,
The purpose is the indeterminacy of the thing. It is not Hans and Fritz. It is not the worker or the capitalist. It is the human being.
What is used as a measure, what should be used as a measure, is the human being compares as a species being, as humanity, as universal, as a whole, and thus as the individual as an exemplar of the species, as an exemplar of everyone, as that he is entitled, as that he has claims to make, and as that he gets what he wants, if it meets these claims that he has to make. A high matter, above all criticism. That shows something. Humanism, which prides itself on speaking on behalf of the suffering creature, that is, identifying and denouncing harmed interests and disadvantaged people. The humanism would by no means be satisfied with the discovery of a damaged interest that does not put up with it. The proof. Workers, you are involved in an economic project here, and you do not benefit at all. From a humanistic standpoint, the proof is not an argument at all. The standpoint, the humanistic standpoint, measures this concern. For instance, the worker demanding higher wages is immediately linked to whether the person is entitled to demand it, and similarly, whether this would actually be in the general interest of humanity. And then there are those who are very quick to say, yes, why should the interest of those who are rebelling actually be better than the interest against which they are rebelling? I would like to remind you, we do not involve ourselves in such questions. We are not engaged in proving to any higher authority, for instance to humanity, that the workers have a higher right to rise up than the entrepreneurs have a right to maintain the status quo. This appeal to a higher subject, clearly, it's not supposed to be God, as we are modern and humanity itself is its higher entity, but the appeal to a higher subject by which individual interests are measured, assigned or denied a right, and then appear as more or less justified. By the way, a story that the world does not care about. That would not be our concern at all. From a humanistic perspective, however, that is the only concern. Is that the decisive concern? And again, here Mr. Marx was able to score points with the humanists when he talked about the capitalism eliminating socialist revolution, said, yes, the class interest of the workers eliminates all classes. The class interest of the workers says, a society in which there are no more classes, thus no exploited ones, are present anymore. The sentence is correct, but in a humanistic way, it is considered the credential of socialist activity. They are strictly to be judged on whether the workers would actually be right if they were to set themselves up. With that, we have reached the point where the phrase, man is the measure of all things, through the intermediate step, becomes man, as in humanity, the species, the human race. Where we have reached the point where any confusion with materialism is finally over, any interchangeability. Man is the measure of all things, according to which one should adjust, has transformed for us in such a way that now suddenly the individual person, the real human, is not the measure, but is being measured.
and the world should not adjust to him, but he should adjust to what is beneficial to the human being. The image of a fictional community is erected, one that has nothing to do with the real one. Because no humanist would want to say, yes, if people do this and that, then it benefits the state. Yes, because it would very quickly raise the question of whether it's even important if it benefits the state. Also, the argument, then it's not good for the economy, would of course never be made from a humanistic standpoint. But it always falls under the perspective, it's not good for other people. And then the higher question immediately arises, and what is good for people at all? At this point, humanism becomes philosophically productive. Philosophically productive means, well, here we go. Inventing, constructing, speculating the substance of the species being, and measuring the concrete, actual human with their concerns and vices against it. The dispute of philosophical images of humanity begins. Some say, hedonistic philosophy image, humans are there to enjoy. The others say that the human is a rational being, and as a rational being, they should subordinate their instincts to reason and do what reason commands. And the third say man is ultimately just life and strives to survive, shake their heads, find the whole thing a terribly pointless process, and come to the conclusion, our life, it would be better if we didn't have it. Then the others come and oppose this and say, if we have nothing else but life, then it is the most important thing.
And everyone together discusses the question of whether humans actually missed the mark or just hit it in their life in how they live.
Here is the paradox of position and claim. The question of whether humans miss their mark. One might note that this is fundamentally flawed in itself. Because whatever people do, they may fail or not with their intentions that they pursue. They may succeed in getting what they want, or they may not. Both happen continuously. But in what they want, failing themselves, maybe someone can pretend for one. You notice here is the idea, the human as the abstraction, as the supreme and overall being, absolutely justified and against whom no one may violate, and the human as real indeed exists doubly. And the idea that a person would exist doubly, as who they are and as who they are as a human, well, that's what initiates the comparison and leads to the paradoxical judgment. The person would miss themselves. We just made a philosophy info about Professor Riedel, who teaches here at the university. He concludes, the modern human essentially misses the point because they always want to achieve something. That brings out the uniqueness in people that they always want something. If he would finally stop wanting something, then he would be at home with himself, at peace. And he would have what is attainable for us humans. A harmony that simply comes from the fact that if you want nothing, then you cannot fail. The conflict of human images. And I just wanted to tell it very abstractly now, as the idea of fixing the human produces the search for images of humans. And naturally, because it's completely unfounded, what is transplanted into this invented human image, naturally the difference, and also the debate of human images. Human images have this amusing aspect, and the philosophical designs that they don't matter at all. It is noticeable, having to make this discovery, that all philosophy strives to say what the human being actually is. They arrive at the most varied, as I have just enumerated, answers. Sometimes humans are this, sometimes that. But in the end, one starts hedonistically, another morally rigoristic like Kant, a third pessimistically like Schopenhauer, and a fourth again optimistically like Nietzsche.
Yes. Then we say yes to the meaningless life. It doesn't matter at all what the result is. In the end, the message is always the same.
It's not at all that philosophy, in its judgment about humanity, with all the differences in its images of people, leads to a different message. In the end, the process itself is the decisive message, and the process is called humanity.
So the process of the movement of thought, or the movement of thought, achieves something.
The real human is merely, and this applies to everyone equally, the real individual with their concerns and interests is merely, well, a more or less unsuccessful expression of the truly higher, which we distinguish from it as its true essence, its essential nature, which is what it's really about. The thought movement alone, the real human, is merely, well, the more or less successful expression is merely the outer shell of the essence that mattered to us and to you. The mere movement of thought is already the entire message, and it means negation, critique of immediate desires, critique of mere interest. Even the hedonists and eudaimonists, the philosophers of happiness, manage that. Even they still manage that. They say, isn't it really about happiness for humans? First step. Second step, but if it's about happiness, what does he gain from money? Third step, well, money can serve some. Fourth step, but if he's alone due to sheer greed, he gains nothing from it. Fifth step, then he should rather share.
And then, according to the eudaimonists, or the utilitarians, who are the philosophers of utility, he should rather make the greatest happiness of the greatest number his concern.
Already his own concern is once again a possible hindrance to his own happiness. Whether you do it like Kant and say everyone should, everyone should obey duty, and duty has the content that the other must also appear as an end. Or whether you say everyone strive for their own happiness, but in the end, you only get your happiness when you share. In the end, and that is the beauty of the thing, the messages of philosophy are absolutely indifferent to the doctrinal edifices. For the movement of thought, the abstraction from the concrete individual, which is then the actual purpose, as the individual's actual purpose is supposed to be maintained as distinct from its concrete interests and so on. The movement of thought itself is the entire message.
As far as the first point, namely humanism and anti-religious attitude, nothing higher is propagated, but rather the peculiar, the human being himself as his higher.
And the dialectic involves that the philosophical formulation of materialism ends in nothing other than the critique of mere interests and utilities and advantages.
Secondly, now a content-related engagement with the positive. So the first of all, already materialism, what's it called? Humanism. And the advocacy for humans is the criticism of the real people's bare interest. But now the second side, it never fits this way, or it does fit this way, but then precisely when it turns critically against claims. But humanism also has the other side, and always wants to have the other side. Namely that humans would be entitled to something. They have claims to make.
The human being is the measure of all things. One cannot trample on people. It must not be inhuman.
The page has it too. And now secondly, the question. So what is a person entitled to? What does humanity demand?
Otarzai, when it said, mere humanity demands that we keep the company in Rheinhausen running for another half year and similar things, well, what exactly is it demanding now?
It's just the reversal of the previous thought. If the idea is that people are absolutely entitled, as long as they are human beings at all, as long as they are not the concrete ones, because the concrete ones raise the question of whether they are justified in everything they do. But as general beings, as humans, they are absolutely justified. Here you realize what the substance of the entitlement is. It is namely the subject. The human is a subject in general. And the main point of the statement, the main emphasis, is on in general. First of all, it merely means at the very least. Only in general is he a subject, namely just like the others, like everyone else. Not what he wants, not what his interest is, but insofar as he is human and partakes in this abstraction of humanity, only in this way is he absolutely justified. All questions, all concerns of any modern person must be posed within this question. Yes, and is this compatible with the world? Does that fit the requirements of the economy? Does that fit the requirements of the community? All concerns that a person has are measured. Only as a human being is he so absolutely justified that everything about him is measured. His concerns are measured against the state, but the state must be measured by whether it serves the human being. And an inhumane state deserves to be abolished.
Yeah, let's say the human being is justified to be a subject at all, of which remains the comical aspect. A subject, apart from what he wants as an individual. Apart from the claims he merely makes as Hans or Michel, merely as a worker or capitalist, apart from that, he is the ultimate purpose, and no one has the right to interfere with him, and everything must be measured by him. Leaving that aside, what remains? That is indeed curious. Now only the inversion of the statement remains. The human being should be a subject in general, and it is the same as not merely being a means. More positive content cannot be derived from this reasoning or this thought. The thought leads merely to the conclusion that the human being is not a total means. Nothing more. And in that, it is already quite abstract.
Abstract, namely, because he
now really doesn't want to know anymore for what a person is a means or not, and really doesn't want to criticize anymore what purpose makes a person a means. But rather, the thought is abstract and stands alongside the purposes to which people are subsumed as means and says, but there must be something left. A human must not dissolve into merely being a means. And it is very silly and very foolish, because ultimately, all decisions hinge on the question, for what purpose is one a means? When during a card game, the discussion starts, and someone says, we need a fourth person, then the fourth person is a means for the other three. They need someone to play cards with. Should one now say, oh, the person is being made into a means? Should one say, but hopefully not entirely? You notice that this concern, hopefully not completely, which so indifferently stands alongside the particular utilizations or usages for this particular middle existence, which are so indifferent towards it that they do not penetrate at all into the question of whether one should be a means for this purpose. Means for this purpose. The whole slogan, man should not dissolve in his own means being, accepts any means being for any purpose, as long as the individual is left with something. The idea has produced a lot of nonsense, especially now again in philosophy. Man should not be a means. Man should not be an object. Just as I did with means, one can do it again with objects. It very much depends on what one is an object for, whether that is good or bad, whether it is beneficial or not. Philosophy radicalizes the idea by no longer engaging with the content and saying, being an object would be terrible. Yes, of course. Being an object of exploitation, an object of strategic planning, that is not healthy. But being a sexual object is not a disgrace. Being an object of admiration is at least something that does not hurt. In this field, with these objects, one must always pay attention to the content. Always be aware of what one is an object of or a means for.
The philosophers, on the other hand, the humanistic perspective, a person must not be a means. The point, a person must not be a means, even though they are useful for others in 1,000 relationships.
The notion, a person should not be merely a means, involves accepting being a means for any purpose, with a reservation added. A condition, and the condition does not pertain to the content of the purpose. Not, what is it about? But the condition is that being a means is acceptable as long as individuality is not violated, as long as the individual can remain a subject, an individual. You can see what is truly meant to be excluded, and there you quickly return to politics. It is simply the corresponding idealism for modern freedom and equality. It is the idealism that truly excludes only one position, namely that of the slave. They should not be slaves.
Which coincide with their use. That is degrading to humans. Therefore, also fascism. They should not be suppliers of raw materials for soap. That is inhumane. That is the limit that is stated. And the reversal means as long as humans maintain the ability to perceive themselves as subjects, as long as the content of a use is not the problem that would humanistically be contested. And also in the second main point, what is a human entitled to, or what does humanity demand? I have now made two statements. Humanity demands that the human being is recognized as a subject at all. And that merely contains the idea that he is not purely a means, not entirely a means. So something is being demanded. And what is being demanded means consideration in use. Consideration in use.
It is now the new conclusion from something like that is not bothered by any purpose, by any use, but is only bothered by completely merging into it, is only bothered by the fact that the person, being a means, is otherwise nothing. And Immanuel Kant expressed it very well in his formulation of the categorical imperative. He said that man should not regard another person merely as a means, but always also as an end in themselves. This also is the entire fundamental content of the humanistic demand.
And this consideration that is demanded is a very ethereal matter. It easily evaporates. The consideration, I'm barely able to articulate the words now, that is required is the opposite of demanding something specific. When I demand something specific, demand consideration, then I demand this and not consideration. In our democratic reality, one often experiences, particularly in the work-capital relationship, that consideration is demanded, and that always means nothing specific.
Consideration means not laying off more people than necessary in Rheinhausen. And when doing layoffs, think about the social consequences.
Yes. This demand is relatively easy to solve for those who let people go. They have taken on two tasks with humanity. The first is that one must enter the discussion on whether all of them are necessary, because unnecessary harassment of people is truly inhumane.
It's really the crucial point. Unnecessary harassment of people should not happen. So the dispute is shifted to the escort. Yes, is it necessary for them to be dismissed? For what purpose?
Yes, that is not being adjusted. For what? For the business that employed them. Well, the entrepreneurs often win the proof as well. And the second, not without consideration, not without, soon also, not without heart, overlook the consequence. Also a very ethereal matter, because what is necessary to provide proof that it did not happen heartlessly is also something completely indefinite and very small. There, gestures are made very quickly. The replacement, for example, for money. The best example is the human dignity of soldiers, an anti-fascist achievement of the Bundeswehr. The principle, which seldom other democratic states have, is not a big deal, but the Federal Republic has it. The soldier also has human dignity. It is a fine regulation. The soldier has it too. And what does human dignity consist of? Well, precisely in that he should not be harassed more than necessary for the military drill.
It is understood that this immediately becomes a case for dismissal, because military drill has the content.
To demand the individual's unquestioning submission to orders, so that the idea that he should not be harassed more than necessary becomes a pure contradiction in itself in ensuring unquestioning obedience. Because obeying calculatingly, in a way testing the reasonableness of the command, is not the same as obeying and does not fulfill the military desideratum of expediency at all. But obeying orders that one considers senseless is letting oneself be harassed, and that is why I can let them be harassed for the sake of militarily efficient training. And the human dignity of the soldier is not something that can ever be positively guaranteed, but rather something that has reality in the institution of the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Armed Forces and his complaints, not in the barracks operation.
The soldier were merely interesting because it is so explicitly defined what dignity or what being a subject means at this point, namely no more than for the utility he is supposed to create, and he is supposed to shoot and be shot, no more than what is necessary for the utility he is supposed to create, should he be drilled and harassed.
Nothing more follows from human dignity or humanity either.
Where this next thought, where this ethereal matter is actually translated into material content, where there should be material authentication of it, where a material authentication should come from to ensure that humans do not completely dissolve into their existence as a means. Where this confirmation should come from, where a positive content should finally come from, it becomes purely negative. No torture, no hunger, no death penalty. The positive content of what can be demanded in the name of humanity is precisely only the repetition of the negative. The humans should not fully dissolve in their role as a means.
And therefore, torture is regarded as
a treatment of humans that not only does not respect their will, this is also done in prison and is not considered inhuman, but that, in a way, nastily extorts their will by their dependence on their own flesh.
And actually what is happening there as man is not even respected as merely coerced. Merely coerced, for example, someone who is imprisoned.
In the case of non-hunger, it sounds more positive, nicer, but is actually just the negation of the very worst. And, as one notices in such expressions, with the negative, always measures itself against what is normal.
In other words, in the name of humanity, you can only criticize excesses anyway. There is no other way. In the name of humanity, if I want to say, do not fully immerse in the role. How do I notice that it is not total? And where does the suspicion arise that it is total? Only in relation to what is normally demanded from people and considered a means of subsistence for them. A minimum level of existence is part of human dignity in the Federal Republic of Germany.
And what is that? A well-calculated ratio to the necessities of life, namely, a sum of money that deliberately falls below them.
That one cannot live on welfare is actually a necessary element of it, because it is measured against wages and should be noticeably below them.
These are the few cases where this demand for consideration translates backward into material content. No death penalty, no torture, no hunger. Many more fields have the human.
Under the functional existence it possesses, it is already implied that it possesses it. Is that a man that solely upholds the negative non-slave possibility of the individual's voluntariness?
And alongside the actual use, completely satisfied by the accompanying ideal assertion. It is quickly determined whether one is treated like a slave or like a master by the politeness of superiors. Whether one lives in a state where one is subjected to a rule or where one is a fellow citizen with the right to vote. Regardless of whether anyone even believes that voting changes anything. The sidestepped denial of mere usage creates an entire realm of symbols in which hats are tipped to the person
and they enjoy having hats tipped to them. When one asks what humanism actually combats as the evil, what is the real evil that it is directed against? It is the lack of respect for humans that it fights. And you notice that even the mention of torture, by the way, which initially sounds rational, and the persuasive power of this slogan is based on the fact that torture is condemned, so that when someone says there should be no torture, there really isn't anyone who says otherwise. That's the appeal of it, and even Pinochet would say actually not. Nonetheless, it becomes clear at this point that even the mention of torture is not right at all.
Because even when mentioning torture, the thought doesn't go like this. Someone is being tortured, but I am against that. And then it continued with, what's this about then? Well, then I want to know why that person is being tortured. What is important here is that one cuts into someone's flesh. Treatment, but torture. Similar to the critique of rape, it is entirely sufficient to mention the matter, to mention it without any deepest judgment, and always discovers only one thing. The purpose that prevails there is of no further interest, but that this purpose had no inhibitions, that is criticizable. The purpose of torture does not appear further. However, it is obvious that respect for people is low when torture occurs. The somehow peculiar purpose that must be present in rape is not the subject of further outrage. But that this purpose had no inhibition is the subject of the outrage, and it is then the inhibition that is demanded. And the restraint with an existing purpose, with a purpose that has been left standing, is the call for internal. And at times, like the current discussion in the Green Party, external limits. The thought that stands up in the name of humanity against inhumane use the idea is about not fully comprehending and then respecting that what is being used is an individual. Even if one should agree with the statement that there should be no torture, even then, one must say that this saying is obviously not appropriate when such things are discovered. The ideal to assure that the deviation does not result in total usage. The misstep, the respect, alongside the use of the human being, who is indeed a subject, implies that the discussion is not really about reality, but rather a question of attitude. It's not about what happens to people in the factory or the military, but in what spirit it happens. That determines whether we must speak of humane, or at least as humane as possible, or indeed of inhumane circumstances. Humanity has recently come up with a new field for this topic of matters of attitude. As it was a year or a year and a half ago with the census, where suddenly it was supposed to be discovered that beyond all usage, beyond all data collection that the state functionally conducts for specific state concerns with the citizen, to make the person totally transparent,
the complete transparency of people through the senses, which no longer appear to have any specific benefit. When it was actually perceived as inhumane, because the transparent person is being produced and they lose their remainder against the state, without anyone knowing why the state would need this remainder or what the person would be missing if this remainder were gone.
Simply, the standpoint that when the person is totally transparent, the subjectivity towards the state is completely gone.
Truly beyond all imagination, what that could mean. Or conversely, this thought as a starting point for the image of imagination, what one can come up with regarding what the state might possibly use it for. And recently, such a thought has also emerged in the context of criticism of genetic technology. In genetic technology, there would probably be something to criticize. Yes, that a modern industry is being advanced where no one knows what will actually come out of it, and where the government regulations are already the protocol that the contradiction of something one cannot control, something that should actually be banned, but of course one does not want to ban, so that risks are programmed. We can criticize all of this. But the critique movement that has focused on this only finds its argument useful as a secondary point in its supply chain. They find a completely different notion important. The notion, namely, that one could possibly genetically engineer a work slave with genetic technology. The idea is fundamentally wrong. It is a concern that one really does not need to have.
A worry that one shouldn't have because it's not possible, because genes cannot make a person. Provide the natural foundations for intelligence needed for work, but to remove the genes for a critical thought about work, that's not possible. Either people have intelligence, then it is not a question of their biological makeup, whether they become critical or not. Or they have none, then you have the products of American brain, or how do you say it, brain amputation in front of you, and then people are like wet sacks and are no longer useful for anything, just barely that the heart beats. Such people, however, are extremely unsuitable as work slaves, because the concern is unfounded on one hand. On the other hand, the unfounded nature of the concern is not a reason for the critics of this genetic technology horror to stop, but rather the opposite. They are not bothered by this at all, but are concerned that whatever is left of a person in relation to their use as an individual could be taken away. It is the concern that humans, in their usage, the idea that a working class could be bred, is the concern that humans could be so absorbed in their use that they no longer exist as a difference to their use. So much so that it doesn't even bother them anymore. The thought has another variation, but it always falls under the same idea. There are people who are currently very outraged that medical extensions of genetic technology or medical applications of genetic technology are, let's say, working towards to breed a certain genetic resistance in humans against certain occupational diseases. First of all, to distinguish them at all. Some people tolerate certain toxins better and develop cancer later, or perhaps not as statistically often as others. To find the difference, well, genetics is concerned with that.
Now there are those who see it as the realization of the ideal, the medical ideal of resilience. Not exactly a humane idea, but the realization of the medical ideal of resilience is found by some to be the greatest horror vision. Where I really have to say, well, if we don't otherwise criticize capitalism, then we also don't need to criticize being better able to endure it. It's absurd. Either we otherwise know a reason against it, or we don't need to complain that we don't get cancer, even though we are in contact with free. How far the retreat point of the humanists can be seen in that humanity already thinks that the individual has a definite right to withdraw from total exploitation through their natural constitution, namely through illness. I have to say, if they don't know any other reason to escape usage, then, well, I don't necessarily have to wish illness on them as the last bit of freedom the individual has. But the thought goes further. It moves away from this memory, almost from this memory of the political. It's almost like when the critics would say, then they must finally despair. If people under capitalism don't even get sick anymore, then their criticism has absolutely no chance. It moves further away from this memory of the political and really gets upset about the people who could be cloned for themselves. That in this country applies. Now one wonders, why aren't they allowed to be cloned? Now one realizes one is only purely in the idealism of individuality, in the idealism that a human must be something that escapes any total subsumption. Now it's finally clear that subsumption would be even worse than earlier subsumption. Under work, under the military, under the role of a citizen, yes, that is still understandable. There are still memories of yes, yes, and then they have to go in for 8 hours a day and 40 a week.
That reminds, there is still the memory of disadvantages.
With the ban on cloning, there's the protection of the uniqueness of the individual beyond all conceivable concern. What would actually be if it were not the uniqueness? Particularly since the only rational idea of the uniqueness of the individual is quite absurd as presented. The only rational idea of the uniqueness of the individual is that I am one. One, meaning that I have a relationship to my own body as the basis of my soul. So perhaps it is a bit idealistic to say that a person is one. It depends on their consciousness of themselves. And this consciousness of oneself is no more to be questioned by the fact that he is cloned, just as little as by the existence of another identical twin, and just as little by the fact that there are siblings who have similar but not identical characteristics, as if the self-consciousness of the individual really depended on that. As if this I am one, I am myself, really depended on that.
And there is not another one like me. That is a passage where the cult of individuality, where the sanctity of the ideal of humanity truly is crazy, meaning creating its own field of activity for its mania, where any memory of where it might have come from, what it should have been, or what was supposed to be warded off, has been completely forgotten. It's as if philosophy, with its phrase about the irretrievability of the individual, immediately became a political slogan. No one, no counterpart twice. Otherwise, humanity is finished.
And very reasonable.
And then there comes the whole idea that humans are the highest in a completely absurd sect. That humans are the highest is no longer proven in there.
Even right away, much more dangerously, not immediately that humans are usefully accommodated. Indeed, the successes of medicine are used for that. And that foreseeable genetic diseases can be cured, or at least the mother is given the decision whether to carry the child to term or not, if she at least knows about it. But that the cult of individuality now leads to the point where one, with the belief that humans are the highest, smoothly transitions to creation and says, and he can only be the highest if his right to be a natural chance is not interfered with by some delusional perfectionist.
Thwarted. His right to potentially be a defective birth, it is the idea that the cult of individuality reaches at this point.
The reversal of this is called, and this is again Riedel philosophy, the delusion of feasibility.
Whoever thinks they can arrange everything, whoever thinks they can design everything practically, violates the inviolability, the sacredness of everything. And when that happens to people, it is the worst. It is known that the idea as ecology has existed all along. So the entire cult of individuality ends again with creation. And the guarantee that humans are the highest has its ultimate basis in not meddling with God's work.
All right, I'll stop here for now. On this topic, man is the measure of all things.
And the dialectic of this judgment, where it leads, where it ascends, and how it belongs to bourgeois society. I have now explained that two addenda. First, the humanism of science. The humanism of science consists in it being science and not philosophy or moral propaganda. The humanism of science does not lie in propelling or promoting humanism, but in simply relating everything to humans. That is a lot, humanistically,
And within that, the entire ideology is already complete.
the entire bourgeois world, with all its institutions, is consistently related to the human being, viewed either as a condition for him or as a product of him, and in this way, and this is the whole deception, automatically very humane.
Crises in the economy come from the misconduct of certain economic agents.
In the state, politics is a way of dealing with the contradiction of humans, that he is personally interested but must still fit into an order. The transition to human in all sciences, to consider every institution, every establishment, not according to what it is, but according to what it is for humans and that it is made by humans. That is the whole swindle. In the end, the whole world seems to be very human and goes on all too humanly.
Secondly, humanity and politics.
There is a big difference whether humanity or consideration for people is initiated from below and then takes on a critical tone, or whether it occurs in politics and then as a means of politics.
namely as a gimmick of politicians. And there we can observe something about the Federal Republic of the 1980s. Politics is becoming increasingly humane. And that is, more and more, politics, in its presentation to the people, refuses to justify purposes or the constraints of politicking. To present themselves to the people as a means of their interest, but as a poorly functioning means constrained by practical necessity. When today, for example, Bloom represents and promotes the health reform, he no longer makes any reference to the compulsion based on facts. That is assumed that was already learned by the German people in the past. When Bloom appears now, he appears only as a human being and takes care of the decency of other people. It is studied that the propaganda on the topic of health reform starts from, yes, could we demand from the other taxpayers that they pay for your gold teeth? From the outset, it's as if there was supervision over the decency of the people. With regard to their interests, not a negative relation to their interests, not an enabled relation to their interests, but from the outset. Yes, these are questions about how people interact with one another. You cannot burden the solidarity community. Politics steps in and immediately leaves out the political aspect in its presentation. It doesn't address factual questions or interests that politics might have, but insists that these are questions of how we interact with each other as people. They are making continuous progress in the field, and now we almost have a complete political generation where there is no one left who hasn't made their career through competition in humanity. How they are all the same now, Kull, who is already human, and Rau and Blum and Engholm. They all outdo each other in humanity. And that is nothing other than organizing the prohibition from the outset in the presentation of politics towards the people, so that discussing political matters is not allowed. How did they shut down questions about the interests of the state or the people? And conversely, one must also say, and only when politics is so undisputed does the competition with humanity work, or the competition of politicians is reduced to their greatest conceivable political freedom, namely that they only compete as characters at all until then. In this respect, the spread of humanity in the public sphere, as they themselves say, the spread of humanity in public space is indeed the indication of the prohibition to approach world interests, the world, politics, and economic life in terms of interest. Everything is now only a matter of solidarity, responsibility, and togetherness. Thirdly, to conclude a story, communism and humanism indeed have a constructive controversy between them, because communism in the East, namely, places importance on being the most consistent humanism and realizing and having realized humanism in the world. And with that, communism has, first of all, gained a point in favor of humanism. Humanism, for its part, like any belief, recognizes everyone else in relation to his own belief. Either the other is a humanist or inhuman.
Well, the Eastern communists also want to be humanists. And the humanists,
Of course, they judge communism by the standards of humanism. Now the communists come and say, yes, but humanism as a private attitude, as a cheap gesture, as cheap charity, as cheap pretense of responsibility alongside the world, that is also not exceedingly honest or sincere. Now communism gets a plus point as the more consistent humanism. Respect means seriousness. It does not want humanism as a personal stance, but aims to establish an entirely humane world.
next step, the humanist becomes skeptical and wonders if the communists are taking humanism too far in their intention to make the world humane.
Pass over the individual people, over the concrete person. So now humanism defends itself against communism by saying, I am just an idea.
Putting myself into reality, oh, that's bad, that's dangerous. In the name of humanity, the greatest crimes have been committed.
Now, humanism comes and defends itself against the suggestion, well, then take your humane standards seriously, with the counter-argument, yes, taking my standards seriously, then there's nothing left of humanism. That can't be taken seriously. It doesn't work any other way than as a personal life stand. As a personal attitude, it is eminently important, because otherwise, everything revolves around the dividing line of human or inhuman. As a personal attitude, it is eminently important, although you cannot make it a principle of reality. What are they actually saying with that?
They are saying that your stuff is only suitable for imagination, for hypocrisy, only suitable for pretending a little bit. 1.5. And they are saying
That the bad in the world should not and cannot be eliminated by them, because a humanist cannot take responsibility for that. But that the bad is there for one to distance oneself from it by personally claiming to be a humanist.
I know the fun. It is indeed war, but I am a humanist.
The notion that humanism is only suited for distancing oneself from the bad, which one knows, and here's the next gag again, and one can be a free and insightful subject within a human community that one records
that one has no influence on what is actually happening.
One distances oneself from the bad. One says, I wouldn't have wanted it, I wouldn't have done it. So once again, the idea, the call. Then finally realize your humanism and put it into practice. Gets the response. Putting that into practice is quite inhuman. So what is humanity? It's the distancing from the bad, about which one officially states they are not to blame. However, this had the strange connotation that one declares oneself as a subject of the human community by saying, what happens here is beyond my control, beyond my responsibility.
See, they are subjects of the human race by saying that they are not subjects of the machine. And that is certainly part of humanism. One could express it differently. The old geezer with the donation penny or the 5.
One person puts a 5 into the donation box.
and immediately says that it's a drop in the ocean. Because if he didn't say it himself, I would always say something else. And he prefers not to have it said by someone else. That it doesn't achieve anything, that it doesn't eliminate the evil, is stated by the one giving the donation, almost as an immunization against suspicion, and as a way to preclude this objection from others. That he doesn't want to change anything is humanistically expressed as being committed to the concrete person. And now suddenly the humanist discovers his entire abstraction, namely in the one who said they should be taken seriously. He said, you, for the sake of an abstract human, overlook the concrete one. Suddenly, the humanist discovered the whole abstraction of humanism, because someone comes along whom he understood, as if that person had said, take it seriously.
So in the end, it turns out that for humanism, for this position, one must have regard for people. Now, with the latest version, one must care for the concrete person. That this implies not only the assumption, but also the affirmation of the human being as a contemptible creature. Quite the opposite of what Marx intended.
That it indeed implies the sufferer as a permanently suffering one. When I say, I must take responsibility for the poor creature, I fundamentally differentiate myself from the communists. They are bothered by some people walking around as suffering creatures and not wanting to eliminate that on their own, but instead gratefully accepting help. It is communist to challenge and not allow the suffering of the creature, indeed the whole consciousness of self-righteousness in suffering. And it is quite different when one says, I want to take responsibility for the suffering creature. That implies the enduring difference of the one who has the means to take responsibility for others. It presupposes the enduring difference between people who are helpless and those who are capable of taking responsibility. It is a patronage relationship that the helper gladly assumes.